Now, I don't think it's the best case scenario for LSU, but it's pretty darn close. I'll explain, plus so much more on today's edition of Locked in LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked in LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, we are part of the Locked On Network, your team every day. My name is Caroline Fenton. You can follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. I appreciate y'all for being here and appreciate you for making Locked in LSU your first listen every day. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on your preferred podcast platform. Wherever you want to find us, we are there. So whenever it came out that Texas and Oklahoma were going to join the SEC, the next question was, okay, what is the SEC going to look like? 2 8-team divisions. Then the two scheduling options kind of came out. More than two, really. We had pods that were in discussion of 4-team pods. And then the two schedule structures that really emerged as the two most likely options for how the SEC was going to move forward with scheduling was the 3-6 and the 1-7. Of course, the 3-6 model, adding an extra conference game onto every SEC team's schedule, playing 3 permanent rivals and 6 rotating rivals. The 1-7 model, you have 1 permanent rival and 7 rotating rivals, which would maintain the 8 in-conference game schedule, which would probably protect, the Vanderbilts or the Missouris of the SEC, would protect their bowl eligibility by being able to schedule 4 out-of-conference games, maybe easier games on the schedule to make it easier for them to make a bowl. Now we have gotten clarity that the SEC most likely will move forward with the 3-6 model, and we now have LSU's proposed 3 permanent opponents. Now, this has not been voted upon yet. This new schedule needs to be approved by the team presidents, and the 3 permanent rivals also needs to be voted on and approved by the team presidents and Greg Sankey as well, and league officials. But we now have a much clearer idea of what the schedule is going to look like and permanent conference rivals. They're adopting the 3-6 model. That's what it seems like is more than likely going to happen with the SEC schedule. I would agree that's probably the best move moving forward. So that way you can protect as many rivalries as possible. I view the SEC as the kind of conference that has primary, secondary, and honestly, even tertiary rivals. I'll use Alabama as an example, and we will get into Alabama. But I'll use Alabama as the example. I would say Alabama's primary rivalry is Auburn. I would say their secondary rivalry is either LSU or Tennessee. It probably lean LSU, considering that's been a little bit more of a competitive rivalry over the last 10 years or so. And then Tennessee or LSU, whichever isn't the secondary, is the tertiary rivalry. You could say the same thing for LSU. Maybe Alabama is the primary rivalry. Maybe Florida is the secondary rivalry. Maybe Ole Miss is a tertiary rivalry. You get what I'm saying here. There's more than one rivalry for each SEC team. So now we have the proposed 3 rivals for LSU. I addressed this several times on the podcast about what I would do if I could pick, if I had a genie in a bottle, how would I construct LSU's schedule moving forward? Honestly, I wouldn't want to get rid of divisions in the first place. I wouldn't want Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC in the first place, but we're past that. We can't do that. If I had a genie in a bottle, and I could choose LSU's 3 permanent rivals, I would choose Alabama, Florida, and Texas A&M. And I'll explain why I would choose those 3. I'll explain that coming up next, kind of what I prioritize in the schedule moving forward. But it's now come out that LSU, and again, this is not voted upon. This is not 100%, pen to paper, signed, sealed, delivered, 100% official. But it has been confirmed that the proposed 3 rivals for LSU are Alabama, Texas A&M, and Ole Miss. While I don't think that is absolute best case scenario, at least in my opinion, I would have added Florida instead of Texas A&M. I think that's pretty darn close. I'm good with that. Honestly, with these 3 proposed rivals, I'm completely happy with that. I've said it before and I will say it again. If Alabama wasn't one of LSU's permanent rivals moving forward, I wouldn't have been happy. And you might say, Caroline, you are absolutely out of your mind. Why do you want to play Alabama every year? Alabama's been the one team that has kept you out of the SEC, championship every single year, so on and so forth. I hear you. I know. But Alabama LSU is an SEC tradition. It is an LSU tradition. It is the one game that if you are asked at the beginning of the season and you only get one game to go to, what are you saying? What do you want to go to? More often than not, you probably want to go to the Alabama game because that's always one of the most anticipated games of the year. The most watched SEC game on ESPN this past year. And keep in mind, ESPN is an important player in all of this because ESPN, the year that Texas and Oklahoma joined the SEC in 2024, has exclusive rights to the SEC. The most watched SEC game, the second most watched college football game on ESPN this past season was LSU Alabama. What was one of the most fun and exciting games to watch this past season? It was LSU Alabama. What is one of the most anticipated games for LSU fans, Alabama fans, college football fans, appreciators of good games in college football? It's LSU Alabama. For me, when I understood, okay, no, this team is legit, like this team is good in 2019 was when LSU beat Alabama. What do we look back on one of the highlights of this past season? Why do we give Brian Kelly an A to A plus for his first year? One of the reasons being LSU beat Alabama. I appreciate that rivalry. That's a fun game. That's a game that I don't want to play once every 3 to 4 years. As long as Alabama is on LSU's schedule every single year, I would have been happy. Now let's get to Ole Miss. That's one of the teams and one of the permanent rivalries that I would have protected if I had 3 wishes, and those 3 wishes were LSU's permanent rivals. Because like Alabama, while it's so different, while it hasn't been nearly as I don't want to say competitive because I don't want to act like the LSU Alabama rivalry over the past 10 to 20 years has been overly competitive. You know, LSU has beaten Alabama twice over the last 10 years. That's not overly competitive. So I don't want to say that the Ole Miss game isn't as competitive, but on a greater scale, I don't think that the LSU Ole Miss game, in fact, I feel pretty certain that the LSU Ole Miss game is not looked at on a national scale as much as or as highly regarded as LSU Alabama is, but it's still so fun. I mean, it's not as competitive, I say, because in the last 10 years, Ole Miss has won the game 3 times. In the last 20 years, Ole Miss has won that matchup 5 times. It hasn't been overly competitive, but I love the Ole Miss game. I think the LSU Ole Miss game has so many roots. It go all the way back to Halloween night, Billy Cannon's miraculous touchdown run. And then you follow that all the way until now. I mean, the LSU Ole Miss game is just so fun. And I remember when I was in school, every single year, the Ole Miss game, in all 4 years I was in school, you know, I obviously went to the game in Baton Rouge. I went to both games in Oxford when I was in college. Every single year, whether it was LSU fans or Ole Miss fans, LSU students, Ole Miss students, everyone always said, God, this is one of my favorite weekends of the year. It's always fun. It's always heated. It's always a good time. So I want to protect that game. And now the one game that LSU is getting that isn't the game that I would have protected is Texas A&M. Now, I chose Florida because I thought that Florida, especially over the past, let's say 5 to 10 years, that rivalry has really heated up a whole lot. And, LSU Florida, I just feel like it just makes sense, right? That's been LSU's permanent out of conference, out of division rival for the longest time. And I know that's not the easiest game to play, but it was always a game that I was excited and always looked forward to. But really, with Texas A&M, I have no bones to pick with that matchup. I knew that was going to be a matchup or a rivalry that the SEC prioritized because it was almost like a fake rivalry that was born whenever Texas A&M joined the SEC. It was like, okay, this feels a little bit forced just because neither LSU nor Texas A&M had a team to play on rivalry weekend, so let's just force this one. But I think over the last 10 seasons, it has been so fun to watch that rivalry unfold organically. I don't like forced rivalries. Like I don't need Oklahoma and Florida to play every single year. That is one of the proposed permanent rivalries moving forward. I know the SEC probably wants to integrate Texas and Oklahoma into, SEC, cornerstones by, play Oklahoma and Florida every year. Let's just get the farthest east and farthest west school in the SEC and kind of, make it feel a little bit more SEC-esque. But the Texas A&M and LSU rivalries have unfolded so organically. You go back to the 7 overtime game. You go back to the fact that the home team has never lost in that rivalry. It's so back and forth. Weird and kooky things happen every single time. Like, let's go back to 2021. Coach O was fired. He was really just trying to end his career on a high note, and he did it on the road at College Station and beat a really solid A&M team. Turn around to this season. We all know what unfolded. A&M had won 4 games at that point. Jimbo Fisher was on the hot seat. LSU, if they won that game, they could have a very strong resume to make the college football playoff. LSU had already won the SEC West at that point, and they pooped the bed, and they lose to a really abysmal Texas A&M team. Like, though that game and that rivalry has been really, really fun to watch. I knew that was going to be a rivalry that the SEC prioritized, given that they created it in the first place. And really, I have no problem with that. I have no bone to pick with the A&M rivalry. Honestly, I'm happy. Like, I step away from these proposed 3 rivalries and I'm pleased. I go back to the proposed rivalries that we initially heard, and it was A&M, Ole Miss, and Mississippi State. And like I said, if there was no Alabama, I wasn't going to be happy. I wouldn't have been as excited about those 3 rivalries. And that's no disrespect to Mississippi State whatsoever. But the history with LSU and Mississippi State just isn't there the way that the history between LSU and Alabama is, or LSU and Florida is. So I'm stepping away from it very, very pleased. I step away from it pleased because I prioritized one thing over another thing. You may think differently because you prioritize one thing over another thing. And I'll explain why I prioritize what I do and why I think this is overall a good thing for LSU. And I'll do that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Built Bar. Because if you're looking for a delicious treat, a delicious dessert, but you don't want all the fat and all the calories, then you have to try Built Bar. We got through the holidays. You might be riding strong on your New Year's resolution, or maybe for Lent, you gave up sweets and you gave up desserts, but you're really starting to get those cravings. You really miss some of that sugary taste. Well, you can satisfy that craving, but you don't have to compromise health. You don't have to compromise your promise for Lent. You don't have to compromise your New Year's resolution, because with Built Bar, healthy is actually tasty. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. I mean, real chocolate. They taste like a candy bar. Plus, they come in flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. They come in delicious flavors, but they're also healthy. They maintain amazing macros. They've only got 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. They will keep you full for hours. And now you don't have to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. You can head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, grab yourself a box of Built Bars, the 4-bar boxes of cookies and cream. I love that flavor. It's delicious. Double chocolate or the coconut puffs. Or if you're closer to a Sam's Club, you can run in there as well. Grab a 13-bar box with the hit flavors brownie batter and churro. So delicious and good for you. You can thank me later. Well, thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Make sure you check out our brand new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. It's got everything that you need to know about college basketball all in one place. Plus, you can hear from big name experts, insiders, coaches, and players. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. So, I like LSU's 3 permanent rivals, at least the proposed 3 permanent rivals: Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas A&M. And that's because there are 2 things that you can prioritize. I like this because I prioritize the rivalry. I prioritize the tradition. I prioritize good games. You might prioritize, on the other hand, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's just simply a difference of opinion. You might prioritize the easiest path to the SEC championship. You might prioritize the easiest path to going 12-0 in the regular season and going to the college football playoff. Totally valid. I totally understand. You might be listening to me saying, why the hell would you want to play Alabama every year when we could have just signed up for, Missouri and Vanderbilt every single year? Why not when you're guaranteed 2 wins every single year? And that's no disrespect to Missouri or Vanderbilt. I understand only a few years ago, LSU did lose to Missouri in 2020, but just in the direction that those programs are going, it would be easy to say, oh, Vanderbilt, cool, automatic win. But let's not forget that there are still 6 other games in conference schedule. I think that we've gotten all so kind of tied up in this 3 permanent rival thing that we've forgotten you still got 6 more games. I mean, it's like with that rate, you're probably going to play the Vanderbilts and the Missouris and maybe the lower level teams or not as competitive teams in the SEC once every few years. A lot more frequently than you would play Vanderbilt or Missouri or South Carolina or whoever it might be in the current SEC structure. Now, when you only play one SEC East rotating team, with Florida aside, now you play 6 of them. So you're going to play those teams a whole lot more. It's not like the Alabamas and the A&Ms and the Ole Misses are the only teams that you play. You might have some of those gimmies on your schedule every single year. It just won't be the same gimme on your schedule every single year. And the reason I prioritize tradition or rivalry games is because that's what I look forward to every year. When have you ever looked at an LSU Vanderbilt game and circled it on your calendar and said, boy, oh boy, I can't wait for this. I can't wait to pack up the van, grab the kids, drive over to Nashville. We're going to throw a huge tailgate, and it's going to be a college game day, and it's going to be a sold out crowd, and it's going to be electric. Never. Honestly, probably never. Nashville's a fun time now. I know it well. But never do we look at those games. Maybe some of the less competitive teams in the SEC and said, wow, oh my gosh, I can't wait for that game. I haven't. I do that, though, with Alabama. I do that with Ole Miss. I do that with Florida, even though I know that Florida's not one of LSU's permanent rivalries. It's the same kind of vibe of that game. Like, I looked at the Texas A&M game this past year and I said, oh, I'm going to that. I've never been because I always went home for Thanksgiving. I never got to go. So I'm going to that game. It's a fun game. It's a fun rivalry. It's fun people. Now, it kind of stunk because we did lose. But those kinds of games are what I look forward to. And I know with the same thing being said, well, you could play those teams a lot more frequently than you would now in the 6-game structure. Like, what's wrong with playing Alabama once every 3 years versus once every year? It's because I want that every year. I want to look forward to that every single year. And then enjoy our trips to Sanford Stadium more frequently. Enjoy our trips to Neyland Stadium more frequently. Enjoy our trips to Nashville against Vanderbilt more frequently. But protecting those rivalries and protecting the tradition of these rivalries. The SEC is changing so frequently. It's changing at a rapid pace, and it's changing pretty massively. The SEC is going to be, I don't want to say unrecognizable in 2024 because I think that's a little bit dramatic, but it's going to be a huge change. Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC. USC and UCLA join the Big Ten. The college football playoff is expanding to 12 teams. It's a whole lot of change. So forgive me for wanting just a little bit of normalcy in my college football season. And LSU Alabama is one of those. I mean, Alabama Auburn is one of those. Georgia Auburn is one of those. Outside of LSU, I mean, there are these rivalries I look forward to every year. I want a little bit of normalcy. I want a little bit of tradition. When everything else is changing and college football now versus, 25 years ago is night and day different. Excuse me for wanting a little bit of the good old days to continue. So that is why I prioritize the rivalries over the ease of schedule. If your team's good, you're going to get there. You're going to get there no matter what. If your team is deserving of a college football playoff spot, you're going to get there no matter who's on your schedule. And also keep in mind, expanding college football playoff means you can afford to have a couple of losses on your schedule. I'm not saying I anticipate that. I'm not saying I want that. I'm not saying I'm okay with that. But let's keep that in mind. You play Alabama every year. It's really hard to beat Alabama 2 years in a row. But let's say LSU goes undefeated outside of Alabama. You're probably a playoff team. Think of it that way. But coming up next, a little bit of a weekend roundup. We will touch on some of the things that we have not gotten to recap on the pod yet. So we'll get into that coming up next. Kind of a wild up and down weekend for LSU sports this past weekend. I will start with the women's basketball game, the semifinal in the SEC tournament. A shocking loss for LSU against the Lady Vols. LSU led by as much as 17 points in the second quarter, and then they just blew it. Honestly, they blew it. They just let that lead go to waste. All of the work that they did to build themselves up, they just let it go to waste. LSU had a 17-point lead, and they ultimately lose to Tennessee 69-67 in Greenville in the SEC tournament. I will say this. I think that was a reminder maybe to Kim Mulkey, to the team, but also I can speak to myself. It was a reminder to myself just how difficult tournament play truly is. You can afford in the regular season, you can afford to mess up. You don't want that, but you can afford it. In the tournament, all you are is a poor defensive outing in the second half against Tennessee away from being bounced from the full thing. All it takes is one slow offensive day from you going home, and then everything that you did in the regular season was all for nothing. It's a cutthroat thing, the tournament is. Let's look back at Kentucky and St. Peter's last year in the men's tournament. If St. Peter's and Kentucky play 10 times, Kentucky probably wins 8 or 9 of them. It was that one bad day that Kentucky had. That's all it took. And their tournament dreams were crushed right there. And I know it was the SEC tournament, and that's different than the NCAA tournament, but I think it's just a reminder in tournament play how key every single game is and how you really cannot afford to let up that many points against Tennessee. And kudos to Tennessee. Tennessee's a good team. I think without checking the strength of schedules, I would say that Tennessee probably has one of the most difficult schedules in the country. They've played some of the top teams in the country throughout this season. So kudos to Tennessee. They ultimately went on to get squashed by South Carolina, but I think that's just going to be the reality of it with South Carolina. They're undefeated with the regular season and in conference play and in the conference tournament, and South Carolina is just that freaking good. But with all that being said, LSU is still going to be at least a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament. LSU is still going to host at least 1 round, if not 2 rounds. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a first and second round host site for LSU. LSU does fall 5 spots from number 4 to number 9 after that loss to Tennessee. But overall, now the only thing that matters is the NCAA tournament. You're not the only team in America that left and was exited from their conference tournament earlier than expected. Put that behind you, move on to the NCAA tournament. At the end of the day, that's really all that matters. So a rough loss for Kim Mulkey and company against the Lady Vols on Saturday. Moving on to tournament play. And the LSU men's team, another loss on the schedule to close out a pretty depressing regular season. Loss to Florida over the weekend, a 79-67 loss. LSU will enter the SEC tournament as a 14 seed. LSU will take on the 11 seed Georgia on Wednesday night. So, let's keep in mind it was a close game last time LSU and Georgia played. It was very back and forth and ended up being a 1-point difference in the final score. So, who knows what could happen? As we saw with LSU women's basketball in the SEC tournament, anything can happen. I will be there. So if you'll be there, come say hey. Also, a massive, massive weekend for LSU baseball. One of the best offensive performances. I would say the best offensive performance I've seen from LSU all season long. And also, I'm going to brag on LSU baseball and also couch all of this with it was Butler and Central Connecticut. And you should wallop those teams. I said that at the very beginning of the season. I don't want to see you let up against the Western Michigans and the Central Connecticut's of the world. Rack up the score, get those points up, prove to everybody that you're the number 1 team in the country. And that's exactly what they did over the weekend. LSU continues to be the unanimous number 1 team in the country. And 2 things really stuck out to me from over the weekend. One of those being Paul Skeens. was the SEC Pitcher of the Week for the second time this season. The last time he had it was 2 weeks ago after opening weekend against Western Michigan. He had 13 strikeouts on Friday night, a career high for Paul Skeens, allowed only 1 hit against Butler, no runs against Butler. The only 2 runs given up on that 12-2 win over Butler on Friday night were Aiden Moffitt and Gavin Guidry, who came in relief. They each let up a run. But Paul Skeens is really, really freaking special. And I think we all already knew that Paul Skeens was really special, but we're seeing it come to fruition and we're seeing it come to life right before our eyes. I mean, Paul Skeens has 36 strikeouts total on the season so far, and we're only a few weeks deep. He has a 0.5 ERA. Anything below 1 is incredible. It's elite. 0.5 is something. Absolutely something. So, another stellar outing for Paul Skeens, another stellar outing for LSU's offense. Friday night, a 12-2 win over Butler, like I mentioned. Saturday, a 26-4 win over Central Connecticut. That was the most runs that LSU baseball has scored since their win over Northwestern State in 2014. So, talking almost 10 years here. I love to see the bats move in. Trey Morgan tonight had 3 runs, 3 hits, and RBI. Tommy White, 3 runs, 3 hits, and RBI. Paxton Kling, 2 runs, 3 hits, 5 RBIs for Tommy White, 1 RBI for Paxton Kling, 4 RBIs for Gavin Dugas. So one thing that I take away from that is we talk so much about Dylan Cruz, rightfully so. Dylan Cruz had a monstrous weekend. We talk so much about Tommy White, rightfully so. Tommy White proved that and earned that reputation at NC State. He continues to prove it at LSU. But my other takeaway is, those guys, that's not just Tommy White and Dylan Cruz, Trey Morgan and Paxton Kling and Gavin Dugas. And then that's just only scratching the surface of the offensive contributions over on Saturday night. So it's not just a 2-man show. That this offense is top to bottom on the lineup. You can get production offensively from really any guy in this lineup. So that is good to see. Also, remember, it was Central Connecticut. It was Butler. The schedule only gets more and more brutal as tournament play kicks up. But from what we've seen so far, you can only play the teams on your schedule. And what we've seen so far is that LSU's looked great. With the exception of 1 blemish against Iowa, early season blemishes are going to happen. I think we've seen LSU bounce back and has looked as advertised. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. But make your second listen our brand new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. Experts Isaac Shade and Andy Patton bring you everything that you need to know on and off the court. Plus, you can hear from big-name experts, coaches, and players throughout the basketball landscape. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.